It was raining that night, not a gentle patter, but the kind that hammers against your roof like an unwelcome visitor. I sat alone in my dim living room, surrounded by blueprints and calculations that represented 6 months of work on a sustainable housing project work that had just been rejected by the investment committee. 18 years as an architect, and I still couldn't convince people that affordable housing could also be beautiful. The rejection letter lay crumpled on the coffee table, its polite corporate language masking what I knew was the truth. They thought I was too idealistic, too stubborn, unwilling to compromise on materials that would have made the project more profitable, but less sustainable. My name is Eleanor, and at 43, I was beginning to wonder if fighting for my principles was worth losing contract after contract. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The clock on the wall showed 11:52 p.m. when my phone rang. The harsh electronic tone cut through the sound of rain, startling me. Is wrong. The screen displayed Victor Hampton, my neighbor, from across the street. We weren't friends, just acquaintances who exchanged pleasantries when collecting mail or during neighborhood meetings. He was in his mid-50s, always well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair and a formal demeanor that spoke of his career as a retired high school principal. Eleanor. His voice sounded different, strained, urgent. I know it's late, I'm sorry, but could you come over? No, I can't wait until morning. I hesitated, confused by the unexpected request. Victor? Is everything all right? No, he said quietly. It's not. Please, just come. Something in his voice, a vulnerability I'd never heard before, made me reach for my raincoat without further questions. I'll be right there. The rain soaked through my shoes as I crossed the street, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he ill? Had there been an accident? Victor had lived alone since his wife Margaret passed away about 14 months ago. Cancer, I'd heard. They'd been married for nearly 30 years. I'd attended the funeral out of neighborhood courtesy, but I remembered how stoic he had appeared, thanking everyone with such composure that it seemed almost unnatural. His house was similar to mine, part of the same development built in the early 2000s, the same general layout but mirrored. A single light shone from what I knew was the kitchen. I knocked, and the door opened almost immediately. Victor stood before me, still dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt despite the late hour, but the shirt was wrinkled, untucked. His eyes were red-rimmed, his normally neat hair disheveled. Thank you for coming, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't know who else to call. I followed him into the kitchen, noticing how the house seemed frozen in time. Family photos lined the hallway, Victor and Margaret at their wedding. On vacations, with a young woman who must be their daughter. I knew they had one child, Alexandra, who lived in Boston. The kitchen was spotless, almost clinically so, except for the table, which was covered with stacks of papers, photo albums, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. I was organizing Margaret's things, he explained, gesturing vaguely at the chaos. After 14 months, I thought I was ready. I stood awkwardly, dripping rainwater onto his immaculate floor. Do you need help with sorting? Victor shook his head. No, I mean, that's not why I called. He poured whiskey into a glass and pushed it toward me, then filled one for himself. I called because today would have been our 32nd anniversary. The admission hung in the air between us. I took the offered drink, unsure what to say. 32 years, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been remembering how it all began. We met in a bookstore, both reaching for the same copy of East of Eden. She insisted I take it. I insisted she take it. Not. We ended up at a coffee shop next door, talking for hours. A small smile flickered across his face before disappearing. And now I'm in this house alone, surrounded by everything we built together. And I can't remember the sound of her laugh. I took a sip of whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through me. I'm sorry, Victor. Don't be. That's not why I asked you here. He sat down heavily at the table. I called you because earlier tonight, I was going through these albums, and I found this. He pushed a photograph toward me. It was a picture of a younger Victor and Margaret standing in front of a half-built structure, both wearing hard hats, and smiling broadly. Our first house, he explained. We designed it together. Margaret was an environmental engineer before she became a biology teacher. She always talked about sustainable living, about building something that would last, but wouldn't harm the earth in the process. He looked up at me, his eyes suddenly intense. Your presentation at the neighborhood meeting last summer about retrofitting homes for energy efficiency reminded me of her. I remembered that meeting. I'd volunteered to talk about simple modifications homeowners could make. Victor had asked several thoughtful questions. I'd been following your work, he continued. The Riverside housing project that was in the paper last year, the community center downtown. You care about creating spaces that serve people and the planet, not just profit margins. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. My professional failures felt so raw, so recent. Those projects were exceptions. Most clients want conventional designs, maximum returns. In fact, I just lost a major contract today because I wouldn't compromise on materials. Victor nodded slowly. That's why I called you tonight. I've been sitting here for hours, thinking about Margaret, about what she valued, what we built together. He took a deep breath. I want to create something in her memory, not a bench, in a park or a plaque on a wall, but something living, something useful. A community garden with an education center where children can learn about sustainable growing practices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared at him, trying to process this unexpected turn. That's a wonderful idea. But why call me at midnight? Because I realized I couldn't wait until morning. Once I knew what I wanted to do, it felt urgent. Like if I didn't set it in motion immediately, I might lose my nerve. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Because I need help. I have the land. We owned a small property on the edge of town that Margaret always said would make a perfect garden. I have some savings. But I need someone who understands how to design a space that embodies what Margaret believed in. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Victor explained his vision. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, more animated. He wanted raised beds accessible to people with disabilities, rainwater collection systems, solar panels, and a small classroom space where workshops could be held. He had already researched local regulations and grant opportunities. I spent a year drowning in grief, he said. Then, another 2 months, just going through the motions, pretending I was moving on. Tonight, looking at our old pictures, I finally understood what I need to do. This project, it gives Margaret's death meaning, continues what she cared about. I sipped my whiskey, thinking, my own professional disappointment suddenly seemed less important. It's an ambitious project, I said finally. It will take time, resources, community support. I know, Victor replied. That's why I need someone who shares the vision. Someone stubborn enough to not give up when things get complicated. He looked at me intently. Someone like you. I design buildings, Victor. I'm not an expert in garden planning or education centers, but you understand the principles. You can learn the rest, or we can bring in specialists. What matters is the underlying philosophy, creating something sustainable, something that serves the community. I found myself nodding. Right. Despite my exhaustion, despite the late hour, I felt a spark of interest, of possibility. We talked until nearly 3 a.m, sketching rough ideas on the backs of envelopes, discussing potential challenges and solutions. Victor's grief was still present, visible in the way his voice occasionally caught or his eyes drifted to the photographs, but alongside it was a new energy, a purpose. As the rain finally began to subside, I gathered my things to leave. I should get some sleep, I said. But I'll think about all this, see what I can come up with. Victor walked me to the door. Thank you for coming over. I know it was strange calling so late. It was, I agreed. Out! But I'm glad you did. He smiled, a small, tentative expression, but genuine. Margaret would have liked you, Eleanor. She had no patience for people who gave up on their principles. As I crossed the street back to my own house, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I felt oddly energized despite the lack of sleep. The rejection letter would still be waiting for me, The failed project's still a reality, but somehow it didn't seem to matter as much. The next day, a Saturday, I found myself researching community gardens and education centers instead of looking for new architectural contracts. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. Victor stood on my porch, looking more composed than he had the night before, holding a folder and 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering me one of the cups. "I brought some documents about the property if you're still interested." We sat at my dining table, spreading out maps and property records. The land was about 3 acres, just at the edge of town, where suburban developments gave way to more rural areas. It had good sun exposure, a small stream running along one edge, and was already zoned for agricultural use. "It's perfect," I said, ideas already forming. We could position the education center here, facing south for maximum natural light. The garden beds could be arranged in a spiral pattern, with the most sun-intensive crops on the outer edges. Victor watched me sketch, occasionally offering suggestions or asking questions. His knowledge of plants and growing conditions surprised me. Margaret was the real expert, he explained when I commented on this. I just absorbed what I could. She had this idea that everyone should know how to grow at least some of their own food. She used to say, "It connects you to the earth in a way nothing else can." Over the following weeks, our midnight conversation transformed into a real project. I created preliminary designs for the education center, a simple structure with large windows, built from sustainable materials. Victor contacted local gardening groups and Margaret's former colleagues at the high school where she had taught biology. Word began to spread. One evening, about a month after that rainy night, Victor invited me to dinner at his house. The kitchen table, once covered with photographs and memories, now held blueprints and plant catalogs. He had cooked a simple meal, pasta with vegetables from his small backyard garden. "Sandra called today," he said as we ate. I told her about the project. I'd never met Victor's daughter, though I'd heard her mentioned occasionally. What did she think? She was cautious, said it seemed like a lot to take on. He twirled pasta around his fork. Then she asked if I was sure this wasn't just a way to avoid dealing with grief. I considered this. Is it? Victor smiled. Slightly, probably, to some extent. But does that make it wrong? If I can channel this pain into something that helps others, something Margaret would have loved. "I don't think it's wrong," I said, "and it's not like you're doing it alone." "No," he agreed, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm not alone anymore." The moment felt significant somehow, though I couldn't have explained why. We continued eating, discussing plans for soil testing, and the grant application I was helping him prepare. As spring turned to summer, the Margaret Hampton Memorial Garden began to take shape. The city council approved our permits. A local construction company, impressed by the project's goals, offered discounted services for the education center. Margaret's former students volunteered to help with the initial clearing and planting. Victor changed too. The formal, reserved man I'd first known gradually gave way to someone more engaged, more present. He still had difficult days, her birthday, the anniversary of her diagnosis, but he faced them differently now. Once I found him sitting quietly among the newly planted berry bushes, tears streaming down his face. She would have loved the blueberries, he said when he noticed me. They were her favorite. I sat beside him without speaking. We had developed a comfortable silence over the months of working together, a way of being present without requiring words. Alexandra visited. In August, a tall woman with her father's serious demeanor and what I imagined must be her mother's warm eyes. She watched Victor giving a tour of the developing garden to a group of elementary school students, pointing out different plants and explaining how the rainwater collection system worked. "I haven't seen him like this since before Mom got sick," she told me as we stood a little apart from the group. "When he first called me about this project, I thought it was just another distraction. Tried so many things that first year. Traveling, volunteering, even dating once, briefly. Nothing. Stuck." "This is different," I said, watching Victor kneel down to help a small boy plant a seedling. Alexandra nodded. "'Cause it's not about moving on. It's about carrying her forward." She turned to look at me directly. "Thank you for helping him do that." The education center was completed in early fall, a beautiful, light-filled space with walls made from reclaimed wood and large windows that blurred the distinction between inside and outside. The opening ceremony attracted more people than we had expected, former students and colleagues of Margaret's, neighbors, local officials, and environmental activists. Victor gave a short speech, his voice steady but full of emotion. He talked about Margaret's passion for education and the environment, about how this garden would continue her work. She always believed that small actions matter, he said, that each choice we make either heals or harms the world around us. This garden is a place where those choices become visible. Standing at the back of the crowd, I felt a surge of pride, not just in the physical space we had created, but in the journey that had brought us here. From that midnight call on a rainy night to this moment of community celebration, after the ceremony, as volunteers served refreshments and visitors wandered through the garden, Victor found me by the herb spiral. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing at the bustling scene around us. "I think it's exactly what you envisioned that night," I replied. "I think Margaret would be proud." He nodded, his eyes bright. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." That night I called when I said I couldn't wait until morning. It wasn't just about the project. I waited, curious. For months after Margaret died, I felt like I was sleepwalking, going through the motions, and that night, looking at our old photographs, I suddenly felt awake, like I'd been underwater and finally came up for air. I needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone who had that same fire Margaret had. He looked at me directly. I didn't just need an architect. I needed a friend. The simple honesty of his words touched me. "Well, you got both," I said. As the garden established itself over the following months, becoming a vibrant part of the community, Victor and I fell into a comfortable routine. Sunday dinners at his house or mine. Morning coffee at the garden's small cafe, which was now run by volunteers. Heated debates about whether to expand the educational programs or focus on perfecting what we already had. We weren't romantic. That wasn't what either of us needed or wanted. But we were more than friends, more than neighbors. We were partners in something meaningful, something that honored Margaret's memory while creating new connections. A year after the garden opened, I received an unexpected call from the investment committee that had rejected my sustainable housing project. They'd visited the Margaret Hampton Memorial Garden and been impressed by the education center's design. They wanted to discuss a potential new project: affordable, sustainable housing with community garden spaces integrated into the design. That evening, I walked across the street to Victor's house, carrying the bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion and a stack of preliminary sketches. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting. "I have news," I said, holding up the champagne. "So do I," he replied, smiling as he stepped aside to let me in. His news was that Alexandra was moving back to town to take a teaching position at the high school where Margaret had taught. She wanted to develop a curriculum around the garden, bringing students there regularly as part of their science education. We celebrated both pieces of news, sitting on his back porch as the evening settled around us. The champagne was perfect, crisp and bright, like the future suddenly seemed to be. "Do you ever think about that night?" Victor asked after a comfortable silence. "When I called you at midnight, often," I admitted. "It changed everything." "Didn't it?" He nodded. "Sometimes the most important moments come when we least expect them." Margaret used to say that crisis and opportunity are often the same thing, just viewed from different angles. I thought about the rejection that had left me feeling defeated, sitting alone in my living room when Victor called. How that moment of professional disappointment had led to something far more meaningful than just another contract. "To unexpected midnight calls," I said, raising my glass. "And to answering them," Victor replied, touching his glass to mine. As I walked home later that night, I looked up at the clear sky, stars visible despite the town's lights. I thought about how grief can shape us, how it can hollow us out, but also create space for new growth. I thought about Victor, who had found a way to honor his loss while still embracing life. And I thought about myself, how helping him heal had somehow healed something in me too. The garden continues to thrive, changing with the seasons, but always remaining true to its purpose. Victor and I continue our partnership, planning expansions, hosting workshops, sometimes just sitting quietly among the plants Margaret would have loved. Our friendship, born from that desperate midnight call, has become one of the most valued parts of my life. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is reach out in our darkest moment. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is answer. The Margaret Hampton Memorial Garden became my second home in those first few months. I found myself there almost every day after work. Sometimes just to check on progress, other times to get my hands dirty alongside Victor and the growing group of volunteers. There was something deeply satisfying about watching ideas on paper transform into reality. The curved pathways taking shape, the education center's foundation being poured. The first seedlings pushing through the soil in raised beds we had built together. Victor and I developed a comfortable rhythm, our different skills complementing each other perfectly. I brought design, expertise, and organizational ability. He contributed patient persistence and an encyclopedic knowledge of native plants that he'd absorbed from Margaret. Over their years together, we'd often work side by side in companionable silence, breaking it occasionally with questions or observations. "Eleanor, what do you think about moving the herb spiral closer to the kitchen area?" he'd ask, wiping soil from his hands. Or I'd point out how the afternoon sun hit a particular corner, making it perfect for heat-loving vegetables. One evening in late spring, as we sat on makeshift benches reviewing the day's progress, Victor pulled a small, worn notebook from his pocket. "I found this last week," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Margaret's garden journal from when we first moved here. She documented everything, planting dates, weather patterns, which varieties thrived and which failed." He opened it, carefully showing me pages filled with neat handwriting, small sketches, pressed leaves. She was methodical, always learning, always experimenting. She'd try something, observe the results, adjust her approach. I glanced at him, noticing how he spoke of her now with fondness rather than raw pain, with appreciation rather than just loss. "You're a lot like her in that way," he continued, surprising me. "The way you revised the rainwater collection system 3 times until you were satisfied. The way you listen to feedback from the volunteers and incorporate their ideas. The comparison touched me unexpectedly. I wish I could have known her." "She would have liked you," Victor said, echoing what he'd told me that first night. But this time, the words carried a different weight, a warmth born of our months working together. As we walked back to our houses that evening, Victor stopped. Suddenly at the garden gate, been thinking about hosting a dinner for the core volunteers. A way to thank everyone for their hard work. "Would you help me plan it?" Of course I agreed immediately. "Your place or mine?" "Actually, I thought we could set up tables right in the garden, under the stars." The idea was perfect. A celebration in the very space we were creating together. For the next week, alongside our regular work, we planned the dinner. Victor worried about every detail, from the menu featuring as many garden-grown ingredients as possible to the lighting solar lanterns hanging from shepherd's hooks. "It needs to be special," he explained, when I teased him about his perfectionism. "These people have given so much of their time." The evening of the dinner arrived, warm and clear. About 20 people gathered, master gardeners who had offered expertise, high school students who had helped with heavy lifting, neighbors who dropped by regularly to weed or water. We set up long tables between rows of young tomato plants, covered them with mismatched tablecloths, and decorated with wildflowers in mason jars. As twilight deepened and conversations flowed around us, I watched Victor moving among the guests, pouring wine, sharing stories about Margaret's gardening adventures, laughing in a way I'd never heard before. Gone was the formal, reserved man who had called me in desperation that rainy night. In his place was someone engaged, animated, present. Later, after most guests had left and we were cleaning up by lantern light, Victor paused, looking around at the garden. "Margaret always wanted to host garden dinners," he said quietly. "We talked about it but never got around to it. Always. Too busy. Always next season." His voice trailed off. I continued stacking plates, giving him space with his thoughts. "I used to think memories were like photographs," he continued after a moment. "Static, unchanging, but they're not. They evolve." Tonight I created a new memory with her, doing something she would have loved in her honor. I looked at him. This man who had begun as a desperate voice on the phone and had become, what? A friend. A partner in something meaningful. Both, I realized. That's a beautiful way to think about it, I said. He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. This garden, it's not just about remembering Margaret. It's about living the values we shared. Connection, growth, nurturing things. He looked at me directly. Thank you for helping me see that. The simple sincerity of his words touched me deeply. In my professional life, I'd designed dozens of spaces, but none had ever felt as meaningful as this garden taking shape under our care. As summer progressed, the garden flourished. And so did something between Victor and me, not romance, but a deep friendship founded on shared purpose. We settled into routines. Coffee at my house on Sunday mornings to plan the week ahead. Impromptu dinners when we worked late. Texts throughout the day, sharing ideas or small victories. One Tuesday afternoon, I arrived at the garden to find Victor looking troubled, standing near the half-finished education center with his phone in his hand. Everything okay? I asked, setting down my bag of design materials. Alexandra called, he said, referring to his daughter. She's coming to visit this weekend? Wants to see the garden? That's wonderful, I replied, but his expression didn't change. Isn't it? Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. She's concerned. Says I'm avoiding grief by staying. Busy thinks I'm using the garden as a distraction. I considered this. Are you? Maybe at first, he admitted. That night I called you. I was drowning. Needed something, anything, to hold on to. He looked around at the thriving garden. Beds, the structure taking shape. But it's become so much more than that. Then show her, I suggested. Let her see what we're building here. Not just plants and buildings, but community. Victor nodded slowly. Will you be here when she visits? I'd like you to meet her. The request surprised me. Of course. You want me to be? I do, he said simply. Alexandra arrived Saturday morning, tall and poised like her father, with intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Victor introduced us somewhat formally, and I sensed her reservation immediately. So you're the architect, she said, shaking my hand. Dad talks about you constantly. There was a slight edge to her words that made me wonder what exactly Victor had told her about me, about our partnership in this project. As Victor showed her around the garden, explaining each feature with obvious pride, I gave them space. Busying myself with the volunteer group that was installing benches near the herb spiral. But I couldn't help noticing Alexandra's body language. Arms crossed, nodding politely, but not enthusiastically, keeping a physical distance from her father. Later, while Victor was deep in conversation with the construction foreman about the education center's windows, Alexandra approached me. Can we talk? She asked bluntly, privately. We walked to a quiet corner of the property, where a small grove of young fruit trees offered some privacy. Alexandra didn't waste time with pleasantries. What exactly is your relationship with my father? She asked. The directness of the question caught me off guard. We're friends, partners in this project. Just friends? Her eyebrow raised skeptically. Yes, I said firmly. Just friends. She studied me for a moment, then sighed. I'm sorry. It was inappropriate. It's just, this whole thing has been so sudden. Dad calls me one night saying he's starting a memorial garden, and suddenly he's talking about you constantly, and the garden is all he can focus on. She looked away. It feels like he's replacing Mom. The words hung in the air between us. I chose my response carefully. Alexandra, your father isn't replacing Margaret. He's finding a way to honor her, to keep her values alive. It gestured toward the garden. Everything here, from the native plant section to the teaching space, reflects what she believed in. He talks about her every day, shares stories about what she would have thought of each decision we make. Alexandra's expression softened slightly. He seems different, more present. That's because he is, I said gently. When I first met your father, really met him, not just as a neighbor. He was lost in grief. Now he has purpose again. That doesn't mean he's forgotten your mother. It means he's found a way to carry her forward. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the garden where volunteers worked together, where children from a local school group were learning about composting, where her father stood tall and engaged. I want him to be happy, she said finally. I just didn't expect it to look like this. Healing rarely looks the way we expect it to, I replied. Later that evening, Victor invited me to join them for dinner at his house. The meal was slightly awkward at first, but as Alexandra began asking genuine questions about the garden's educational programs, the tension gradually eased. By dessert, she was sharing memories of her mother's passion for teaching, stories I hadn't heard before. Mom used to bring plants to her classroom all the time, she told me, smiling at her father. Remember the time she brought that giant pumpkin, Dad? One that took both of you to carry? Victor laughed, a full, warm sound. The students named it Gerald, for some reason. Mother insisted on referring to it formally Mr. Gerald the pumpkin throughout her lesson on plant life cycles. Watching them share this memory, seeing the love and laughter between them, I felt privileged to witness this moment of healing. Alexandra caught my eye across the table and gave me a small nod, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. It was enough. After Alexandra's visit, something shifted in our little community. Word about the garden spread further, drawing visitors from neighboring towns. Local schools began arranging field trips. A nearby restaurant asked if they could source herbs and specialty vegetables from us. The education center was completed. In early fall, a beautiful light-filled space with large windows and sustainable features throughout. The day we finished, Victor and I stood inside as the last construction workers packed up their tools. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the bamboo flooring. "What do you think?" I asked, watching him take it all in. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "It's better than I imagined." We planned an official opening ceremony, inviting the community, local officials, and of course Alexandra, who had become more supportive after seeing the project's impact firsthand. The day before the ceremony, I found Victor sitting alone, in the garden at sunset, looking contemplative. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, sitting beside him on a bench we had built together. "Not nervous," he replied. "Just reflective. A year ago, I was in the darkest place I've ever been. Couldn't see a way forward." He turned to look at me. "Then I called you at midnight, and everything changed. You did the hard part." I reminded him. "You reached out. You took action." Shook his head, "But you answered. You showed up." Not everyone would have. We sat in companionable silence as the light faded, watching fireflies begin to appear among the plants. "I've been thinking about what's next," Victor said after a while. "For the garden, but also for me." I waited, sensing he needed space to formulate his thoughts. Margaret and I had plans travel we wanted to do, places we wanted to see together. After she died, I couldn't bear to think about those dreams. But lately, he paused. "Lately, I've been thinking that maybe the best way to honor her is to live fully. To do some of those things, even without her." "That sounds right to me," I said gently. "There's a botanical garden in Kyoto that she always wanted to visit. I'm thinking of going in the spring." He glanced at me. Would you look after things here while I'm gone?" The request touched me deeply, a sign of trust, of our shared commitment to what we'd built together, of course. "The garden will be waiting when you return." The opening ceremony the next day exceeded all our expectations. Over 100. People came, neighbors, students, local farmers, city officials. Alexandra flew in with her husband. Even my former clients from the investment committee attended, curious about the project that had taken me away from conventional architecture. Victor gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes, including mine. He spoke about Margaret, about how her love of nature and teaching had inspired the garden. He thanked everyone who had contributed, saving special words for me that made me blush with their generosity. "None of this would exist without Eleanor," he said, gesturing to the education center behind him. "Her vision, her dedication, her friendship, they've been the foundation of everything we've accomplished here." Afterward, as people mingled and explored the garden, Alexandra found me near the herb spiral. "Thank you," she said simply, For helping him find his way back? I shook my head. He found his own way. I just walked beside him for a while. She smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of Victor. Sometimes that's exactly what we need, someone to walk beside us through the dark places. As winter approached, the garden entered a different phase. Most of the vegetable beds were put to rest under covers of mulch, but educational programs continued in the new center. Victor and I focused on planning for the next growing season, developing workshops, applying for grants to expand our reach. One snowy evening in December, almost exactly a year after that midnight call, Victor invited me for dinner at his house. He had prepared Margaret's favorite meal, roasted salmon with dill sauce, using dill we had grown and preserved from the garden. As we ate, he seemed both reflective and somehow lighter than usual. "I've been thinking about time," he said as we finished our meal. "How it changes things, changes us. A year ago I couldn't imagine feeling anything but grief, couldn't imagine finding purpose again." I nodded, understanding completely. My own life had transformed just as dramatically over the past year, from professional disappointment to meaningful work. From neighborly acquaintance with Victor to deep friendship. "Margaret used to say that gardens teach us about impermanence," he continued. "Nothing stays the same. Plants grow, bloom, die back, return. Seasons change. But there's comfort in the cycle and knowing that renewal follows rest." He reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, a gesture of connection, of gratitude. He helped me see that life could have meaning again. Not the same meaning as before, but something new, something worthwhile. "The garden did." "That?" I demurred. "Not just the garden," Victor insisted gently. "Your friendship. Your willingness to answer a midnight call from a desperate neighbor. We talked late into the night, remembering the past year's challenges and triumphs, sharing hopes for the garden's future." When I finally rose to leave, Victor walked me to the door. "I leave for Japan in 3 weeks, he reminded me. "Are you sure you're okay overseeing things while I'm gone?" "Absolutely," I assured him. "Take the time you need. Experience everything. Take pictures to share when you return." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I will. And Eleanor. You for everything." As I walked back to my house through the gently falling snow, I thought about how a single connection, that desperate midnight call, had altered both our lives. How Victor's grief had opened a door to purpose, how my professional setback had led to the most meaningful project of my career. I thought about the garden waiting under its blanket of snow, resting before spring's renewal. And I thought about Victor finding his way toward a new chapter while honoring what came before. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is reach out in our darkest moment. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is answer. And sometimes what grows from that connection is more beautiful than either person could have imagined alone. The winter transformed our garden into a different kind of beauty. Snow draped the raised beds like white blankets, ice crystals formed delicate patterns on the greenhouse windows, and the education center stood as a warm haven against the cold. While the growing had paused, our work continued. I developed new workshop curricula, coordinated with local schools for spring programs, and managed the small team of dedicated volunteers who came regardless of weather. Victor left for Japan in January, his eyes bright with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I haven't traveled alone in over 30 years, he admitted as I drove him to the airport. "Margaret was always the navigator. You'll find your way," I assured him, "and discover things about yourself in the process." He nodded, gazing out at the winter landscape passing by. "That's what I'm counting on." His first email arrived 3 days later, a description of his Tokyo hotel, the overwhelming sensory experience of the city, and his amusing attempts to navigate the subway system with a translation app. I smiled reading it, hearing his voice. In every carefully constructed sentence, more messages followed as he made his way to Kyoto. Photographs of temples nestled among maple trees, detailed accounts of gardens he visited, reflections on the concept of the Japanese appreciation for negative space, for pauses and emptiness as essential elements of beauty. "Margaret would have loved this philosophy," he wrote. She always said that the space between plants was as important as the plants themselves, that growth needs room to breathe. I'm beginning to understand that grief works the same way. It needs space, acknowledgement. You can't just fill every moment with activity, with noise. There needs to be reflective emptiness for healing to happen. His insights moved me, revealing how his journey was becoming about more than just fulfilling Margaret's dream. It was becoming his own path toward a different relationship with his loss. Meanwhile, at the garden, I faced unexpected challenges. A heavy snowstorm damaged part of the greenhouse roof. A pipe froze and burst in the education center kitchen. Grant paperwork hit complications. I handled each issue as it arose, sometimes consulting Victor via email, sometimes making executive decisions when time was of the essence. One evening in February, as I was working late in the education center office, Alexandra called. She'd been keeping in regular touch with her father, but wanted an update from my perspective. "How's it really going?" she asked after we exchanged. "Pleasantries. Dad makes everything sound perfect in his emails." I laughed. "Not quite perfect, but we're managing." The greenhouse incident was more dramatic than he probably described. "And how are you doing?" Her questions seemed to carry more weight than casual concern. "I'm good," I replied, somewhat surprised by her interest. "Busy, but it's fulfilling work. Dad says you've practically moved into the garden office." I glanced around at the papers spread across the desk, the empty coffee cups, the pillow and throw blanket on the small couch where I'd napped more than once when working late. "It's convenient," I defended mildly. Alexandra was quiet for a moment. "He relies on you a lot." "We rely on each other," I corrected. "This has always been a partnership." "I know," she said, her tone softening. "I'm grateful." "His emails from Japan. I've never seen him process his feelings this way. He's different. More reflective. More open." After we hung up, I sat thinking about Victor's journey, both the physical one through Japan and the emotional one he'd been on since that midnight call. How far he'd come from the desperate, grief-stricken man who had reached out in his darkest moment. How far we'd both come, I realized. The garden had changed me too, had given me purpose beyond just designing buildings, had connected me to community in ways my professional practice never had. As February melted into March, the garden began stirring from its winter slumber. Early crocuses pushed through patches of snow. Buds appeared on the fruit trees. The volunteer team grew again as warmer weather beckoned people outdoors. Victor's emails continued, but with a new development, he had extended his trip. After Kyoto, he decided to visit other regions of Japan, then accepted an invitation from a botanical garden director he'd met to see similar projects in South Korea. "I hope you don't mind overseeing things a bit longer," he wrote. "I've discovered something unexpected. I'm enjoying my own company. For so long, I defined myself through Margaret, through our shared life. Now I'm learning who Victor is on his own." I wrote back immediately. "The garden is thriving. Stay as long as you need. This time is yours." And it was true. The garden was flourishing under the combined care of our volunteer community. What had begun as Victor's memorial project had evolved into something truly communal. Local families adopted garden beds to tend, retired botany. Professors started leading free weekend workshops. Neighborhood children came after school to help water and weed, delighting in the responsibility. One warm April afternoon, as I was coaching a group of middle schoolers on transplanting seedlings, I looked up to see a familiar figure walking through the garden gate. For a moment, I didn't recognize Victor. He was tanned, his usually precise haircut grown slightly longer, his formal posture relaxed. He wore hiking boots and carried a weathered backpack, looking more like an adventurer than the reserved former principal I'd known. The children noticed my distraction and turned to follow my gaze. One of the regular volunteers recognized Victor and called out a greeting. Within moments, he was surrounded by people welcoming him home, asking about his travels, expressing how much they'd missed him. I hung back, watching his easy interactions with the community that had formed in his absence. When the crowd finally dispersed and he made his way toward me, I felt an unexpected nervousness, as if meeting someone both familiar and new. "Eleanor," he said warmly, setting down his backpack. "The garden looks amazing. "Welcome home," I replied, suddenly aware of my dirt-stained hands and messy ponytail.
Todo bien.
"We didn't expect you for another 2 weeks. I wanted to surprise you."
Nice.
His smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that highlighted new laugh lines. And I couldn't miss the spring planting. We walked through the garden together as he took in all the changes. New sections developed, improvements made, additions to the education program. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, expressing genuine appreciation for decisions I'd made in his absence. "You've transformed this place," he said as we reached the herb spiral, now lush with new growth. "We all have," I corrected. "It's been a community effort." He nodded, looking around at the volunteers working in various areas. The children learning in the outdoor classroom space, the elderly couple sitting on a bench, simply enjoying the environment we'd created together. "Yes, that's what Margaret would have loved most," he said quietly. "Not just the plants or the design, but this people, connecting, learning, growing together." We ended up on the porch of the education center as afternoon faded into evening. Victor unpacked some gifts. He'd brought back specialty from Japan, handmade garden tools, a book of botanical illustrations. As we talked, I noticed subtle changes in him beyond the physical ones, a new thoughtfulness in his speech, quiet confidence, an ease with silence that hadn't been there before. "I kept a journal," he told me, pulling out a leather-bound notebook filled with his neat handwriting. "First time in my life. Started as notes about gardens I visited, but became something more reflective." He turned pages filled with sketches, pressed flower petals, small watercolor paintings. I found myself writing letters to Margaret in it, not from grief anymore, but from this new place I've discovered. Sharing experiences with her, but acknowledging she's not physically here to respond. The intimacy of this revelation touched me. "That's beautiful, Victor." In Kyoto, I met an elderly gardener who had lost his wife years ago. He told me something I'll never forget. Victor looked out at the garden, now golden in the evening light. He said, "Grief is not something you overcome. It's a companion you learn to walk with, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always part of your journey." I nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. "And how is your companion these days?" Victor smiled, a genuine expression free from the shadow of pain that had once accompanied any mention of his loss. "We've reached an understanding, grief, and I carry Margaret with me, her values, her passion, her love of beauty, but I'm also discovering who I am without her physical presence." As darkness fell, we lit lanterns around the education center porch and continued talking about his travels, about the garden's development in his absence, about plans for the summer season. There was a new balance between us, a shift I couldn't quite define but could certainly feel. "I should let you get home," he said eventually, noticing the late hour. "Duh. You must be exhausted from running everything these past months." "Actually," I admitted, "I've been staying in the small apartment above the education center most nights. It was easier than going back and forth, especially during the winter storms." Victor looked surprised. "You've been living here?" "Semi-living," I clarified. "My house is still there, still has all my stuff. I just found myself wanting to be closer to the garden." He nodded slowly, understanding. "It gets under your skin, doesn't it? This place, this purpose." "Completely," I agreed. The next morning, Victor arrived early, carrying breakfast from the local bakery and fresh coffee. We sat in the morning sunshine, planning the day ahead, falling easily back into our partnership, despite his months away. I watched how warmly they greeted him, how naturally he stepped back into the community while honoring the developments that had occurred in his absence. There was no possessiveness, no need to reclaim control, just appreciation for how things had grown and evolved. Over the following weeks, we established new routines. Victor took on morning educational programs, sharing knowledge from his travels. I focused on administrative tasks and design improvements. We met for lunch daily, comparing notes, solving problems. Sometimes just enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Alexandra visited in May, bringing Macy, her 8-year-old daughter who had only met her grandfather a few times before. The little girl took to the garden immediately, wide-eyed at the butterflies, fascinated by the worms in the compost bins, delighted by the taste of fresh peas straight from the vine. One afternoon, I found Victor sitting on a garden bench with Macy, patiently teaching her how to make pre-seed flower bookmarks, something Margaret had apparently done with Alexandra when she was young. Grandpa says Grandma Margaret loved flowers more than anything, Macy told me seriously when I joined them. He says she would have taught me all about them if she was still here. Victor met my eyes over his granddaughter's head, his expression a complex mixture of sadness and joy. "That's right," he said gently. "But you know what? She did teach you through me. Everything I know about plants came from her." That evening, Alexandra found me in the Education Center kitchen, preparing dinner for all of us. "Thank you," she said simply, picking up a knife to help chop vegetables. "For dinner, it's nothing fancy, not for dinner." She continued chopping, her eyes on the task. "For this place, for what it's meant to my father." She looked up at me. "I've never seen him like this with Macy, so present, so peaceful. Before, when he visited us, there was always this tension, this sadness he was carrying. Now." She gestured toward the window, where we could see Victor and Macy examining something in the butterfly garden, their heads bent together. In concentration, I understood what she meant. The man outside was whole in a way he hadn't been when I first truly met him. That desperate midnight caller seeking something to hold on to in his grief. The garden did that. I said. Alexandra shook her head. "Not just the garden, the purpose." "Yes, the community, definitely. But also you, Eleanor. Your friendship, your partnership in this vision." Her words stayed with me long after she and Macy returned home. Thought about them as summer arrived in full force, bringing abundant harvests and busy educational programs. Victor and I settled into a rhythm that felt both professional and deeply personal, running the garden together, sharing meals, solving problems, celebrating small victories. One evening in July, as we sat on the Education Center porch after a particularly successful workshop day, Victor turned to me with an unexpected question. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" Directness caught me off guard. "What do you mean, with your life?" With this, he gestured to encompass the garden, the Education Center, perhaps our partnership. "You were a successful architect with your own firm. Now you spend most of your time running educational programs and managing volunteers. Is this fulfilling what you need?" I considered the question seriously, looking out at the garden now golden in the evening light. "When you called me that midnight, I was at a professional crossroads. Frustrated with designing buildings that prioritize profit over people and planet, I turned to face him. It's the most meaningful thing I've ever helped create. It serves people, builds community, teaches sustainability. So yes, I'm happy." Victor nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "I've been thinking about the future," he said after a moment. "The garden's future, but also mine." I waited, sensing he needed space to find his words. "When I started this project, it was about grief, about honoring Margaret. But it's become something more, something alive and growing, something that brings people together." He looked at me directly. "I don't want it to be just a memorial anymore. I want it to be a true community resource, a place of learning and connection that will continue long after we're gone." "What are you thinking?" I asked, intrigued by the determination in his voice. "A formal non-profit organization," he replied, "with a board of directors, proper funding structures, a long-term plan for sustainability, something bigger than just you and me." The idea resonated immediately. We'd been operating informally, funding most activities through Victor's savings and small donations, managing everything ourselves with volunteer help. A proper organizational structure would secure the garden's future. "I love it," I said, "but it's a big undertaking." "I know." He smiled, a confident expression that reflected his growth over the past months. "That's why I'm hoping you'll do it with me, as co-director." The offer took me by surprise. "Victor, before you answer," he continued quickly, "I know. It would mean officially shifting your career path. But you're already doing the work, Eleanor. You've been the heart of this place as much as I have." I didn't need time to consider. The garden had become my passion, my purpose, Yes, I said simply. Let's do it together. A smile brightened the gathering dusk. I was hoping you'd say that. Over the next weeks, we developed a vision for the Margaret Hampton Community Garden and Education Center as a formal nonprofit organization. We consulted with lawyers, drafted mission statements, reached out to potential board members from our community of volunteers and supporters. Alexandra, visiting again in August, offered her professional expertise in nonprofit management. It could help with the organizational structure, she suggested one evening as the three of us sat reviewing documents. Maybe even join the board if you think that would be appropriate. Victor looked touched by her offer. I'd like that very much. As summer transitioned to fall, our vision began taking concrete shape. We secured initial grant funding, formed a board of directors that included Alexandra, the retired botany professor, and several dedicated community members. We expanded educational programs to include evening classes for adults, weekend workshops for families, and specialized courses for local farmers interested in sustainable practices. Through it all, Victor and I maintained our partnership. Different in skills and approach, but united in purpose. He brought wisdom, patience, and deep horticultural knowledge. I contributed design thinking, organizational skills, and networking abilities. Together, we created something neither of us could have built alone. On a crisp October evening, almost 2 years after that midnight call, we hosted a special dinner in the garden to announce the official formation of the nonprofit and to honor the community that had made it possible. Long tables were set up between the now mature vegetable beds, decorated with flowers grown on site and lit by strings of solar-powered lights. Victor gave a speech that moved many to tears, including me. He spoke about beginnings born from endings, about how grief can, with time and purpose, transform into something beautiful. He thanked everyone who had contributed to the garden's growth, saving special words for me that made me blush with their generosity. Eleanor answered a desperate call in the middle of the night, he said, his voice steady and warm. She didn't know then that she was answering a call to purpose, to partnership, to creating something meaningful that would touch countless lives. I will be forever grateful that she picked up the phone. Later, as guests mingled and enjoyed food harvested from the very garden we were celebrating, Alexandra found me near the herb spiral. He's happy, she said, watching her father across the garden. Deep in animated conversation with a group of young environmental science students. Truly happy, not just distracted from grief, but engaged with life. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Victor who had called me that night, broken, desperate, unable to see a future, had transformed into this man confidently sharing his knowledge. Building community, creating legacy. You know, Alexandra continued thoughtfully, when Mom died, I worried about him constantly. Couldn't imagine him ever finding his way to joy again. She turned to me. Thank you for proving me wrong. He found his own way, I replied. I just walked beside him for a while. She smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of Victor. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. Someone to walk beside us through the dark places until we can see the light again. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Victor and I found ourselves alone on the education center porch. Looking out at the garden now, illuminated only by strings of lights and the rising moon. What are you thinking? I asked. Noticing his contemplative expression. About journeys, he replied. How we never know where they'll lead when we take the first step. He turned to me, his eyes reflecting the gentle lights. When I called you that night, I was just trying to survive until morning. I had no idea we'd build all this together. I smiled, thinking about my own journey from frustrated architect to fulfilled co-director of a community garden and education center. Life's most meaningful paths often begin with unexpected turns. Victor nodded, looking out at the garden that had grown from his grief and our shared vision. Margaret used to say that the most beautiful gardens embrace uncertainty. They leave room for surprise blooms, for plants that seed themselves. The unexpected gifts that nature provides when we don't try to control everything. Wise woman, I said softly. She was. There was no pain in his voice now when he spoke of her, just warm remembrance. She would have loved what we've created here. Not just the physical space, but the community, the connections, the learning. We sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around us, lost in our own thoughts, yet completely present with each other, partners in something meaningful, friends bound by purpose and mutual respect. 2 years earlier, a desperate midnight call had connected us, a man drowning in grief, a woman at a professional crossroads. Now we sat together in the garden that had grown from that moment of connection, surrounded by the tangible results of our shared vision. Sometimes the darkest moments can lead to unexpected light. Sometimes the bravest call for help opens doors to purpose and meaning neither person could have imagined. And sometimes what grows from that connection changes not just to lives, but an entire community. The years flow like seasons in a garden, each with its own character, its own challenges and rewards, its own beauty. 5 years have passed since that midnight call that connected Victor and me in a moment of desperation. 5 years of growth, both for the Margaret Hampton Community Garden and Education Center, and for us as individuals. What began as one man's attempt to honor his late wife has blossomed into something neither of us could have imagined that rainy night. Today, I'm standing at the entrance to our expanded property watching school buses arrive for our annual Harvest Festival. Children pour out, excited faces turning toward the garden that now spans nearly 8 acres. What was once an empty plot of land has become a vibrant ecosystem. Vegetable gardens, fruit orchards, native plant sanctuaries, demonstration areas for sustainable growing practices, and at its heart is the education center that has hosted thousands of visitors. "You're looking philosophical this morning," Victor says, appearing beside me with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, a ritual we've maintained through the years. "Just taking it all in," I reply, accepting the mug gratefully. At 60, Victor still rises with the sun, still approaches each day with the quiet energy that has driven our project from the beginning. His hair is completely silver now, his face more lined, but his eyes remain bright with purpose. 5 years, he says, following my gaze across the garden where volunteers are setting up activity stations for the festival. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I called you, desperate and alone. Other times, it feels like a lifetime I finish for him." We've developed this ability to complete each other's thoughts, a natural outcome of years working side by side, he nods, sipping his coffee. "In the best possible way. Our nonprofit organization has flourished beyond our initial hopes. What started with just the 2 of us and a handful of dedicated volunteers has grown to include 4 full-time staff members, dozens of regular volunteers, and partnerships with local schools, universities, and environmental organizations. Our educational programs reach thousands of people annually, from preschoolers learning where food comes from to retirees mastering sustainable gardening techniques. Alexandra serves as our board president, flying in monthly from Boston, where she now teaches environmental education, a career shift inspired by her involvement with our project. Her daughter Macy, now 13, spends every summer with Victor, developing a love of plants and a confidence in the garden that would have delighted Margaret. As the festival activities begin, Victor and I separate to oversee different areas. I head to the new culinary education space, where local chefs are preparing to demonstrate seasonal cooking using our garden harvest. This building, a state-of-the-art teaching kitchen with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vegetable gardens, was completed just last year, funded by a major grant we secured together. Throughout the morning, I move from station to station, watching children press apples for cider, learn about composting, harvest sweet potatoes, and create art using natural materials. Everywhere I see the impact of what we've built, not just in the physical space, but in the connections forming between people. The knowledge being shared, the joy on faces young and old. Near lunchtime, I find myself at the memorial bench we installed in the center of the original garden plot. It's a simple wooden seat with a small plaque. Margaret Hampton, teacher, gardener, inspiration. Victor sits here often, sometimes to reflect, sometimes to rest, sometimes simply to feel close to the woman whose legacy inspired everything around us. Today, I'm surprised to find Macy sitting on the bench, her long legs stretched out in front of her, a sketchbook open on her lap. She's drawing the herb spiral with remarkable skill for her age, capturing the textures and forms with careful attention. "That's beautiful," I say, sitting beside her. She looks up, smiling. Thanks, Eleanor. I'm working on a whole series. Garden through the seasons. It's for Grandpa's birthday next month. You'll love that, I tell her, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Macy turns a page in her sketchbook, showing me earlier drawings, the apple trees in bloom, the butterfly garden at summer's height, the pumpkin patch with fat orange globes nestled among vines. Her talent is evident, as is her deep connection to this place. Mom says this garden saved Grandpa, she says suddenly, her young face serious. That he was really sad after Grandma died until he started building this place with you. The directness of children never fails to surprise me. We saved each other, I think. I reply honestly. I was at a crossroads in my life too. Macy considers this, tapping her pencil against the sketchbook. That's what I like about gardens, she says finally. How things can grow together and help each other. Like how beans fix nitrogen in the soil for the corn, and corn gives beans something to climb on. I smile at the wisdom in her observation. Exactly like that. Later, as the festival reaches its peak with hundreds of visitors exploring the garden, I find Victor in the Education Center's small library, a quiet space filled with books on gardening, ecology, and sustainable living. Many belong to Margaret, donated by Victor when we first established the center. Others have been added over the years, creating a valuable resource for our community. Taking a break from the crowds? I ask, joining him at the window that overlooks the bustle of activity outside. It's just for a moment, he admits. Watching it all from here gives me perspective. Look at what we've created, Eleanor. Together we observe the scene below, families learning together, volunteers sharing knowledge, children discovering the wonder of growing things. The garden is alive not just with plants, but with purpose, with connection, with the very values Margaret championed throughout her life. I had a conversation with Macy earlier, I tell him. She's wise beyond her years. Victor smiles, pride evident in his expression. Margaret's influence, I think, not directly of course, but through me, through Alexandra, through this place. She said the garden saved you, I say softly. He's quiet for a moment, considering, but not in the way people might think. He turns to face me fully. It wasn't just about staying busy or having a distraction from grief. It was about finding meaning again, about continuing what Margaret and I valued together, education, sustainability, community, and it was about discovering that I could still contribute something worthwhile to the world, even after losing her. His words resonate deeply with my own experience. For me, it was about finding work that truly mattered, I tell him. Before you called that night, I was designing buildings that would stand for decades but might never truly serve their communities. Now, everything we create here has immediate, tangible impact on people's lives. We make a good team, Victor. Says simply, a statement that encompasses 5 years of partnership, of shared vision, of complementary strengths. The best. I agree. As evening approaches and the festival winds down, Victor and I make our traditional rounds, thanking volunteers, checking that everything is properly stored for the night, ensuring the garden is ready for tomorrow. A routine we've perfected over the years. Moving through the space with the ease of people who know every path, every plant, every purpose. We end, as we often do, on the porch of the original Education Center, now used primarily as our administrative space since the new teaching facilities were built. This porch has been the site of countless conversations, planning sessions, moments of celebration, and occasional frustration. It feels like home in a way my actual house rarely does these days. I've been thinking, Victor says as we settle into the comfortable chairs we placed here years ago, about the future, about next steps for the garden, I ask curious, about the thoughtful tone in his voice. For me, he clarifies, I'll be 61 next month. Not ancient, but not young either. I wait, sensing he has more to say. Alexandra has invited me to spend a few months in Boston next year. She's developing an intergenerational gardening program at her school and wants my input. He looks at me directly. I'm considering it. Prospect of Victor being away for months creates an unexpected hollow feeling in my chest. After 5 years of daily partnership, his absence would be keenly felt. But I recognize the opportunity this represents for him, a chance to share his knowledge in a new setting, to be closer to his family, to continue growing in his own journey. You should go, I say sincerely. The garden will be fine. An amazing staff now, and I'll be here. Victor nods, looking relieved at my support. I've also been invited to speak at a conference in London next spring on community gardens as healing spaces. His voice holds a hint of wonder at this. Development. They want me to talk about our journey here, how it began with personal grief and grew into community purpose. That's wonderful, I tell him, genuinely pleased at this recognition of what we've built together. You have so much wisdom too. Share, Victor. The world should hear it. He's quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the garden in golden light. None of this would have happened if I hadn't made that call, he says softly. If I hadn't reached out in my darkest moment, and if I hadn't answered, I add, we sit in companionable silence as twilight deepens around us, reflecting on the unlikely journey that brought us here from desperate midnight call to thriving community resource. From grieving widower and frustrated architect to purposeful partners in something meaningful. Later that evening, after the last visitors have departed and we've locked up the education center, Victor walks me to my car. Over the years, I've gradually moved most of my belongings into the small apartment above the original education center, finding it more practical to live on site as our programs expanded. But I still maintain my house across the street from Victor's, returning there occasionally when I need space or a change of scenery. I have something for you, Victor says unexpectedly, pulling a small, wrapped package from his pocket. I was going to wait for our official anniversary next month, but today seems right. Curious, I unwrap the gift to find a beautiful hand-bound journal. Its cover made of handmade paper embedded with flower petals and seeds. Had it made by that artisan who taught the paper-making workshop last summer, Victor explains. Paper contains seeds from our garden, Margaret's favorites. If you ever wanted to, you could plant pieces of it and they would grow. I run my fingers over the textured surface, touched by the symbolism and thoughtfulness of the gift. It's beautiful. Why today? Victor gestures toward the garden, now silvered with moonlight. Watching everything come together today? The children learning, the community gathering, all of it. I was struck by how far we've come from that desperate night. His voice grows soft. I called you because I was drowning in grief, because I couldn't see a future. Never imagined we'd build all this together. I hold the journal close, understanding its significance, a record of growth, of possibility, of life continuing in unexpected ways. Thank you. I'll treasure it, he smiles, the familiar expression that has become such a constant in my life. Write our next chapter in it. The following morning, I wake early, drawn outside by the particular quality of autumn light that makes the garden glow. Find myself walking the paths alone, cup of coffee in hand, taking in the evidence of yesterday's festival, the slight trampling of grass where activity stations had been set up, a forgotten child's hat near the pumpkin patch, empty cider jugs waiting to be returned to storage. I make my way to Margaret's memorial bench and sit, opening the journal Victor gave me. Its blank pages seem to invite reflection, evaluation, vision. 5 years since that midnight call. 5 years of purpose, of growth, of meaningful work. 5 years of partnership with a man who reached out in desperation and found not just a neighbor willing to help, but a true friend and collaborator. What would I write in this journal? Perhaps the lessons we've learned together, that grief can be a doorway as well as a barrier, that purpose gives pain meaning, the community builds resilience, that growth requires both nurturing and patience, that the most meaningful connections often begin in unexpected moments. As the sun rises higher, casting long shadows across the garden, I hear familiar footsteps on the path. Victor appears, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee, having guessed where he'd find me. Early thoughts? He asks, settling beside me on the bench and nodding toward the open journal. Reflecting on what we've learned, I reply, accepting the coffee gratefully. On how far we've come. And where we're going, he adds. We sit together as the garden awakens around us, birds returning to the feeders, bees beginning their daily work among the fall blossoms.
All tears.
Arriving to continue the cleanup from yesterday's festival, the education center that grew. From Victor's grief and our shared vision now serves hundreds of people weekly, teaching sustainability, building community, honoring Margaret's values in ways more vibrant and far-reaching than either of us could have imagined that rainy night. Victor says thoughtfully. When I first called you at midnight 5 years ago, I thought I was reaching the end of something, the last desperate act of a man who couldn't see morning coming. I nod, understanding. Instead, it was a beginning. The best kind, he agrees. One that grew slowly, naturally, like everything worthwhile in a garden. We continue sitting in comfortable silence, watching the day unfold around us, secure in the knowledge that what we've built together will continue to grow and evolve. The Margaret Hampton Community Garden and Education Center has become more than either of us alone could have created a living legacy. A healing space, a place of learning and connection. 5 years ago, a desperate call in the darkness connected to neighbors in a moment of raw vulnerability. Today, the garden that grew from that connection serves as a reminder that even our darkest moments can lead to unexpected light.
Ow.
That reaching out when we're most broken can be the first step toward building something beautiful, and that sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with 4 simple words. Come over now. I can't wait until morning. As volunteers begin arriving for the day, calling greetings to us across the garden, Victor and I rise from the bench, ready to continue the work that has given both our lives renewed purpose. The journal tucked under my arm holds blank pages, waiting to be filled with our continuing story, not just of a garden or an education center, but of 2 people who found meaning together when they needed it most. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is reach out in our darkest moment. The kindest thing we can do is answer. And sometimes what grows from that connection changes not just to lives, but an entire community, creating ripples of impact that extend far beyond what either person could have imagined when the phone rang at midnight. 5 years ago, a desperate call. Today, a thriving garden. Tomorrow, seeds continuing to grow in ways we have yet to discover. This is the power of connection, of purpose, of transforming personal pain into community healing. This is the legacy of that midnight call that changed everything. I look at Victor, my partner in this unlikely journey, and smile. Ready for another day in the garden? Always, he replies, his eyes reflecting the morning light. There's still so much to grow. I was sitting at my desk one Tuesday evening when Victor Hampton called at midnight. Come over now, he said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't name. I can't wait until morning. I didn't know then that answering that call would change everything, not just for Victor, but for me, and eventually for our entire community. I didn't know that from one man's grief would grow a garden that would feed bodies and souls, that would teach generations about sustainability, that would create connections where isolation once lived. I didn't know that the desperate voice on the phone would become my closest friend, my most trusted partner in building something meaningful in this world. I just knew someone needed help, so I answered. And sometimes that simple act, reaching out in darkness, responding with presence, is where the most beautiful journeys begin. 10 years have passed since that midnight call changed the course of my life. A decade of growth, challenges, triumphs, and unexpected turns that neither Victor nor I could have anticipated on that rainy night when he reached out in desperation, and I answered. Today, the Margaret Hampton Community Garden and Education Center spans 15 acres, a nationally recognized model for sustainable urban agriculture and intergenerational learning. What began as one man's attempt to honor his late wife has evolved into something that transcends personal grief to address community needs in ways we never imagined. I'm standing in our newest addition, a climate-controlled research greenhouse, where we partner with the State University on drought-resistant crop studies. Through the glass walls, I can see students gathering data, measuring plant growth, documenting results that might someday help farmers adapt to changing climate conditions. Beyond them, elementary school children are being led through our sensory garden, touching, smelling, and tasting their way to a deeper understanding of the natural world. There you are, says a familiar voice behind me. Victor, now 70, moves more slowly these days, but his eyes still hold the same brightness. The same purpose that has driven our shared vision all these years. The film crew is looking for you. They want to do your interview by the original herb spiral.
I nod, gathering my notes.
Public broadcasting is here, creating a documentary about community resilience projects across the country. Our garden is their featured case study, a prime example of how grassroots initiatives can transform neighborhoods, address food insecurity, provide educational opportunities, and build social connections across generational and cultural divides. As we walk together through the garden, I marvel at how much has changed since those early days. The original 3 acres have expanded 5-fold through land donations and strategic purchases. Our staff has grown from just Victor and me to 25 full-time employees and hundreds of volunteers. Our educational programs reach thousands annually, from preschoolers to senior citizens. But the most profound changes aren't in the physical space or organizational structure. They're in the people whose lives have been touched by this place, including Victor and me. Nervous about the interview? Victor asks as we navigate the central pathway lined with native perennials, a section dedicated to supporting local pollinators. A little, I admit. It's still strange to think of our story as inspiration for others. Smiles. The familiar expression that has become such a constant in my life. That's the magic of it, though. We didn't set out to create a model or win awards. We're just trying to make it through each day, to build something meaningful from grief. We passed the community kitchen built 5 years ago, where cooking classes are underway. Through the large windows, I see people of all ages working together, transforming fresh harvest into nutritious meals. Many are participants in our food security program, residents from underserved neighborhoods learning culinary skills while taking home fresh produce and prepared foods. This expansion into food justice work began almost by accident, when a local teacher mentioned that many of her students had never tasted fresh vegetables. What started as occasional field trips evolved into comprehensive programming addressing nutrition, education, cooking skills, and food access. Now our mobile market travels to senior centers and food deserts throughout the county, bringing affordable produce and gardening know-how to those who need it most. Ms. Eleanor calls a teenage girl waving enthusiastically from the youth leadership garden, a section entirely planned and maintained by high school students. Jasmine has been part of our after-school program since she was 12, a shy girl who found confidence through growing things. Now 17, she coordinates our youth volunteer program and plans to study sustainable agriculture in college. Your squash looks amazing. She reminds me of Alexandra at that age. That same determination, that passion for making a difference. Alexandra, now a professor of environmental education, serves as our board president, flying in monthly for meetings. Her daughter Macy, at 18, has just started college with a double major in environmental science and art, a combination. Inspired by years of summers spent at the garden with her grandfather, we arrive at the original herb spiral, the first garden feature we built together all those years ago. The herbs have been replanted countless times, but the spiral itself remains unchanged, a touchstone of our journey. The film crew is setting up equipment, adjusting lighting, testing microphones. We'll be ready for you in about 15 minutes. Want to capture both of you talking about how this all began, that midnight call that started everything. As they continue their preparations, Victor and I settle on a nearby bench, one of several memorial seats, dedicated to community members who have passed, but whose spirits remain part of this place. 10 years. Sometimes I still can't believe what grew from that desperate night. I follow his gaze, taking in the expanse of green, the diverse tapestry of plants and people interacting in countless meaningful ways. We've come so far from those first raised beds and that small education center. Not just the garden. Us, me, you, all of it. Of course, transformation extends far beyond the physical space. Victor, once drowning in grief, unable to imagine a future without Margaret, has become a respected elder, a teacher, a man who carries his loss not as a crushing weight but as profound wisdom to share with others. He's written 2 books, one about the healing power of gardening, another a memoir of his journey from despair to purpose. He travels several times a year, speaking at conferences, consulting with communities looking to create their own garden projects. And I've changed too. The frustrated architect who once designed buildings that might never truly serve, their communities now create spaces where healing happens daily, where learning is tangible, where connections form across unlikely boundaries. I've found my true calling not in steel and concrete, but in soil and seeds, in creating environments where people can grow alongside plants. Remember when we thought we were just building a memorial garden? Victor chuckles. And now we're running an agricultural research station, a food justice initiative, an environmental education center, a community kitchen, and a nationally recognized model for urban resilience. The film crew signals they're ready, and we move to our positions by the herb spiral. The director asks us to share the story of how it all began. That pivotal moment when Victor called and I answered was at the lowest point of my life. My wife Margaret had been gone for 14 months, and I was drowning in grief, unable to see any purpose in continuing. That night, surrounded by her photographs, her belongings, the remnants of our 30-year marriage, I reached a breaking point. He describes how he picked up the phone without a clear plan, just knowing he needed human connection. Needed someone who might understand his vision for creating something meaningful from his pain. I called Eleanor because I'd seen her passion for purposeful design, for creating spaces that serve people and planet. I didn't know if she'd answer, let alone agree to help a desperate neighbor with a vague idea in the middle of the night. The camera turns to me, and I share my perspective, sitting alone with my professional disappointment. The rejected sustainable housing plans, the questioning of my career path, the unexpected call that pulled me from my own isolation into connection, into purpose. Victor's call came at exactly the right moment. Not just for him, but for me. I was questioning whether my work mattered, whether I was making any real difference in the world. His vision for a memorial garden that would serve the community, it resonated immediately. We described those early days drawing plans at Victor's kitchen table, marking out the first garden beds, recruiting initial volunteers, watching something beautiful emerge from grief and frustration. What we didn't realize then was that we weren't just building a garden, we were building a community. We were creating a space where healing could happen, not just for me, but for anyone who needed it. The director asks about turning points. Moments when we realized the project was becoming something bigger than we'd initially envisioned. I share the story of our first harvest festival, when hundreds of people came to celebrate and learn. How we noticed children who had never seen vegetables growing. Elderly residents who lit up when sharing gardening knowledge from their youth. Isolated individuals finding connection through shared work. That's when we understood that the garden wasn't just a memorial to Margaret. It was becoming a living, growing answer to so many community needs for fresh food, for education, for meaningful connection across differences. Victor nods. Margaret was a teacher at heart. She believed that knowledge should be shared, that learning happens best through direct experience. Seeing children discover where food comes from, watching elders pass down traditional growing practices, I knew she would have loved this evolution of our original vision. The interview continues as we walk through the garden, pointing out key features and sharing stories of impact, the veteran who found healing through our therapeutic horticulture program, the refugee families who grow traditional crops in our community plots, the intergenerational mentoring that happens naturally as seniors and youth work side by side. When the cameras finally stop rolling, the director thanks us with genuine emotion in her voice. What you've built here is extraordinary. Not just the physical space, but the community, the healing, the purpose. As the film crew packs up their equipment, Victor and I continue our daily rounds, checking in with staff, greeting volunteers, solving the inevitable small crises that arise in a space this dynamic. By late afternoon, we find ourselves back on the porch of the original education center, now our administrative headquarters. Though the porch remains our favorite spot for reflection. They ask good questions, but they miss the most important one, which is, what happens next? Where do we go from here? It's a question we've been discussing more frequently as Victor approaches his 70th birthday. While still actively involved in the garden's operations, he's been gradually stepping back from day-to-day management, focusing more on writing, speaking, mentoring younger staff. I've been thinking about that. The garden has become so much more than either of us could have imagined. It has its own momentum now, its own community driving it forward. Victor nods thoughtfully. That was always the goal, wasn't it? To create something sustainable, something that would outlast us. But I prompt, hearing the unspoken qualification in his voice. But I'm not done growing yet. There's still more I want to do, more I want to learn. I wait, sensing he has something specific in mind. Alexandra called yesterday. The university, where she teaches, has received funding for an international exchange program partnering with community gardens in different countries to share knowledge, strategies, approaches to climate adaptation. Sounds fascinating. They want me to be part of it. 6 months traveling to garden projects across South America, Africa, and Asia, documenting traditional knowledge, sharing our experiences here, building a global network of community resilience initiatives. The prospect both excites and concerns me. 6 months is the longest Victor would have been away since the garden began. While our organization now has excellent staff capable of handling operations, his wisdom and presence would be deeply missed. And selfishly, I would miss my friend, my partner in this decade-long journey. You should do it. This garden was built on the idea of growth, not just for plants, but for people. This is your chance to grow in new directions. Relief crosses his face. I was hoping you'd say that, but I wouldn't go without knowing everything here is in good hands. He looks at me directly. Your hands, Eleanor. You've become the heart of this place as much as I ever was. The vote of confidence touches me deeply. Over the years, our partnership has evolved, shifted, deepened. We've moved through grief and purpose to something more complex. A friendship founded on shared vision, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's growth. The garden will thrive while you're away, I assure him. And think of the new ideas you'll bring back, the connections you'll make. Victor smiles, the familiar expression that has become such a constant in my life. That's what I love about you, Eleanor. You never fear change. You see the possibility in it. As evening approaches, we walk together through the garden one last time before closing. The late afternoon light casts long shadows across the paths, illuminating the vibrant autumn colors of late-blooming flowers and ripening fruit. Volunteers are finishing their tasks. Staff members are locking up greenhouses and classroom spaces. Visitors are reluctantly heading toward the exits. Near the original memorial bench dedicated to Margaret, we pause.
Ow.
The simple wooden seat has weathered beautifully over the years, developing a patina that speaks of countless conversations, quiet reflections, moments of both sorrow and joy. She would be proud, I say softly. Knowing how much Margaret's approval still matters to Victor even after all these years. Of the garden, he asks. Of you, I clarify. Of how you transformed grief into purpose, how you've touched so many. Lives how you've continued growing. Victor's eyes grow moist, but his expression is peaceful. 10 years ago, I couldn't imagine living without her. Now I understand that I never had to. She's been part of this journey all along, through the values we shared, through the community we've built in her name. As we continue toward the garden entrance, staff and volunteers call goodnight, heading to their cars or bikes. The garden settles into evening quiet, birds making final calls before roosting, irrigation systems humming softly, the earth releasing. The day's warmth. Will you come visit me? Victor asks suddenly. During the exchange program, perhaps in Peru or Kenya? I'd love to see some of these places through your eyes, to share that experience. The invitation surprises and touches me. I'd like that very much, I reply. It's already thinking of how we might incorporate new ideas from international projects into our own garden. At the main gate, we part ways, Victor heading to his house across the street, me too, my apartment above, the education center where I've lived full-time for the past 8 years. The arrangement has suited us both, close enough for daily partnership in the garden, separate enough for individual lives and privacy. Dinner tomorrow, he confirms. Our standing Tuesday tradition, still holding after all these years. Of course, I reply. I'll cook. As I climb the stairs to my apartment, I reflect on the day the documentary interview forcing us to articulate our journey. Victor's news about the international opportunity, the constant hum of activity throughout the garden that no longer depends solely on either of us to thrive. 10 years since that desperate midnight call. 10 years of purpose, growth, meaningful work. 10 years of partnership with a man who reached out in his darkest moment and found not just a neighbor willing to help, but a true friend and collaborator in building something beautiful. From my window, I can see most of the garden and the fading light, the original plots where we first broke ground, the education center built with sustainable materials, the community kitchen where cultures and generations mix over shared meals, the research greenhouse developing solutions for a changing climate. All of it growing from one connection made when a grieving man couldn't wait until morning. I opened the journal Victor gave me 5 years ago, its pages now filled with observations, ideas, reflections on our shared journey. On a fresh page, I begin to write about today, the documentary, Victor's upcoming adventure, my own thoughts about the future. As I write, I realize that our story is far from complete. Like any good garden, it continues to evolve, to surprise, to offer new possibilities with each season. The midnight call that connected us was not an ending, but a beginning, the first seed of something neither of us could have envisioned alone. 10 years later, that seed has grown into a flourishing ecosystem of plants and people, of learning and healing, of purpose and connection, and the growth continues. Victor will travel, bringing our experience to other communities while gathering new wisdom to bring home. I will guide our garden forward, maintaining what works while remaining open to evolution. Our staff and volunteers will contribute their own ideas, their own passions, ensuring the project remains vibrant and responsive to community needs. This is the true legacy of that desperate midnight call, not just a beautiful garden or successful programs, but the understanding that our darkest moments can lead to unexpected light if we have the courage to reach out, answer, to build something meaningful together. As night settles fully over the garden, I close my journal and stand at the window, watching the solar lights along the pathways gradually illuminate. They create a constellation of gentle brightness, mapping the contours of what we've built. Together, in the distance, I can see the light in Victor's study window where he's likely planning for his upcoming journey. Researching the places he'll visit, envisioning new possibilities. 10 years ago, two isolated individuals connected in a moment of vulnerability. Today, that connection has grown into a community that nourishes bodies and souls, that teaches sustainability and resilience, that proves how purpose can emerge. From pain when we have the courage to reach out and the compassion to answer, tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new growth. The garden will continue to evolve, as will Victor and I, as will everyone whose life is touched by what we've created together. This is the nature of living things, constant change, adaptation, renewal. But some things remain constant. The value of human connection, the healing power of purposeful work, the way small actions can lead to profound transformation. These are the perennial truths at the heart of our garden, the lessons we continue to learn and share a decade after. That midnight call changed everything. As I prepare for sleep, feel a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that began with Victor's desperate words. "Come over now, I can't wait until morning." Little did either of us know that answering that call would lead to 10 years of meaningful work, of community building, of personal growth, and to whatever new adventures await us in the chapters yet to be written. Sometimes the most important connections begin in our moments of greatest vulnerability. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys start with a simple act of reaching out. And sometimes what grows from that connection can transform not just two lives, but an entire community. The midnight call that once seemed like the end of everything turned out to be just the beginning. What an extraordinary garden has grown from those seeds of desperation and hope, and how much more there is still to cultivate, to harvest, to share. I met Eleanor when I called her at midnight, desperate and alone. I didn't know then that she would become my closest friend, my partner in creating something meaningful from my grief. I didn't know that together we would build a garden that would feed thousands, teach generations, heal hearts beyond my own. I just knew I couldn't wait until morning, that I needed someone to hear me in my darkest moment. She answered. She came over. She listened. And from that simple human connection grew something neither of us could have imagined alone. A living legacy that continues to evolve, to surprise us, to teach us that our greatest pain can sometimes lead to our most meaningful purpose. I called at midnight because I couldn't see morning coming. Now, 10 years later, I wake each day grateful for the light, for the garden, for the friend who answered when I reached out in darkness. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is ask for help. Sometimes the kindest thing we do is answer. And sometimes, the most beautiful gardens grow from the most unlikely beginnings, a desperate call, compassionate response, and the courage to plant seeds of hope when all seems lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.